You know what scares me most about this story? It isn't the mystery of the dead woman. It isn't the husband, the betrayal, or even the silence that followed. What scares me most is how easily it could have gone the other way. How close Sarah came to never knowing she'd been erased at all. I want you to think about that for just a second before we begin, because this is a story about a woman who was replaced in her own life, her own kitchen, her own photographs, her own marriage, and who did something almost nobody does. She didn't fight. She didn't bargain. She didn't slowly disappear. She walked out the front door and burned the map back. And 6 months later, a phone call from a realtor in British Columbia changed everything she thought she understood about the cottage she'd fled to, and about herself. Let me take you to Calgary first. Let me take you to the moment it all broke. Sarah Mitchell was 52 years old on the Thursday afternoon she drove home to collect more clothes from the house she'd lived in for 31 years. 45 minutes from her sister Jennifer's apartment in Inglewood, down the road she'd driven so many thousands of times that her hands knew every turn before her mind registered it. Past the Tim Hortons where she used to take Emma and Marcus for hot chocolate after skating. Past the school where she'd volunteered every Friday for 7 years. Past the church where they'd baptized both children, renewed their vows on their 25th anniversary, buried 3 grandparents. Calgary in October is a particular kind of cold. Not the brutal, bone-snapping cold of January, but the cold of something ending. The aspens along the Bow River dropping their leaves all at once. The sky a flat, pewter gray that sits on the city like a lid. Sarah had always loved this time of year. She'd loved wrapping herself in her good cashmere sweater, the burgundy one David had given her for their 20th anniversary, and making soup from the last of the garden vegetables. She'd loved the particular quality of afternoon light through the kitchen window in October. She was wearing the cashmere sweater when she put her key in the door. She wasn't expecting anyone to be home. David's car wasn't in the driveway. She'd assumed she had the house to herself for at least a few hours, time to pack without explanation, without negotiation, without having to perform composure in front of someone who had already watched her composure crack. She stepped into the front hall and heard laughter from the kitchen. Women learn early how to read a laugh. Not what it means intellectually, but what it means in the body. The kind of laugh that belongs. The kind of laugh that's been there before. The kind of laugh that has already learned the dimensions of the room it fills. The laugh coming from Sarah's kitchen had been in that kitchen before. It knew where the light fell in the afternoon. It knew the acoustics. Sarah stopped in the hallway. 31 years of marriage had given her a very specific education in David's laugh. The polite one, the nervous one, the genuine one he reserved for moments when he forgot to be anyone but himself. She heard that last one now, the genuine one, coming through the kitchen doorway at 2 p.m. on a Thursday, directed at someone who was not her. She walked to the kitchen doorway and stood there. She saw it all in the space of approximately 4 seconds. The woman was younger, not dramatically, not insultingly, but perceptibly. Mid-40s probably. Blonde hair that fell in the kind of effortless waves that require significant effort. A linen dress the color of sea glass, somehow unwrinkled despite the chill outside, suggesting either sorcery or a very expensive car ride. She was standing at the kitchen island arranging flowers in the cobalt blue vase Sarah had bought in Banff on their 28th anniversary trip. Arranging them with the casual proprietary confidence of someone who had touched those flowers before. David's hand was on the small of her back, not gripping, not formal. The hand of someone who had rested there many times and had stopped noticing he was doing it. 4 seconds. The flowers. The hand. The laughter that had already learned the room. The woman looked up and saw Sarah. Her expression didn't shift toward guilt or alarm. It shifted toward warmth, which was somehow worse. "Oh, you must be Sarah," she said, and her voice was genuinely pleasant, which was somehow worse still. "David's told me so much about you. I'm Christine. I've been helping him with the planning committee for his retirement party." Sarah heard the words. She processed them. the planning committee for the retirement party that was still 3 months away, for which apparently Christine had been spending enough time in this kitchen to earn that easy laugh, that casual hand. "She's also been helping me figure out what to do with this kitchen," David added. And here is the thing she noticed. He did not quite meet her eyes. He looked somewhere between her face and the middle distance, at the neutral air to her left. "You know, I never understood your organizational system." Your organizational system. The words landed somewhere below her sternum, in the place where 31 years of accumulated evidence about who she was in this house was stored. Your organizational system. As if what she had built and maintained and improved and adapted over 3 decades in that room was a personal quirk, an eccentricity. A system that had baffled and inconvenienced him, as if the kitchen had been hers alone because she'd made it too complicated for anyone else to understand, rather than because she'd been the one who cooked in it, stocked it, cleaned it, organized birthday cake ingredients at 11 p.m., and held crying children at the island counter, and hosted 22 Christmases, and calculated school lunch nutrition for a child with a peanut allergy for 6 years running. She'd kept count, that last part. She'd kept a journal during Emma's elementary school years, partly for humor, partly because she'd needed some record that the repetition was real and accumulating. 6,000. 247 school lunches. She knew the exact number. She'd written it in the final entry on the last day of 6th grade with a kind of triumph she hadn't expected to feel. Your organizational system. Christine was gesturing with manicured hands. "I suggested we move the coffee station to this corner," she said, indicating the east wall. "Much better flow for morning routines, don't you think?" But it was the photograph that stopped Sarah's blood entirely. On the refrigerator, in the exact spot where Sarah's photo had hung for 14 years, the one from Jasper where she and David had renewed their vows at the Fairmont and looked genuinely happy and genuinely themselves, there was a new photograph, printed, mounted with magnetic clips. David and Christine at a restaurant, his arm around her shoulders, both of them mid-laugh. The Jasper photo was gone. She had been removed from the surface of the refrigerator where she'd lived for a decade and a half, and replaced with someone newer. She stood very still and understood something she had been slowly approaching for 3 weeks, circling it the way you circle a flame when you're not sure if you want warmth or if you're afraid of being burned. She understood it now completely, without ambiguity, without the mercy of partial comprehension. She hadn't just been separated from her husband. She hadn't just been left. She'd been replaced, substituted, overwritten the way you overwrite a document you no longer need, not deleting the original so much as covering it entirely with something else until the original content might as well not exist. The person who had run this kitchen for 3 decades, who had chosen that vase in Banff, who knew without thinking which cabinet held the spare light bulbs and which drawer had the warranty documents and which shelf was slightly warped and needed the measuring cups arranged a specific way. That person had been quietly, efficiently removed from this room and replaced with someone who was still learning where the coffee station should go. David turned to her. "You should probably call first next time," he said, his voice in the gentle managing register he used when he wanted awkwardness to dissipate. "This is awkward for everyone. You should probably call first next time, to come home, to enter the house she'd cleaned every week for 31 years, the house where she'd nursed both his parents and her own mother through their final months, the house she'd chosen over the condo she'd actually wanted because its backyard had room for children to play. Call first, as if she were a visitor, as if the house now belonged to a social arrangement she wasn't part of. Christine touched David's arm, a small unconscious gesture of possession, and said something Sarah didn't hear. She didn't hear it because something was happening inside her chest that required all available attention. Not an emotion exactly, more like a geological event, a fault line she hadn't known existed shifting beneath everything she'd built on top of it. Clarity doesn't always arrive slowly. Sometimes it arrives complete, like a bone that has healed wrong and must be deliberately broken and reset to become functional. You feel the break, you feel the pain, but you also feel the rightness of it, the necessity. She was not going to fight for space in her own home. She was not going to compete for visibility in her own life. She was not going to slowly fade in this kitchen while Christine's laugh learned its acoustics. She was not going to negotiate her way back into a narrative that had already written her out. She turned around and walked back through the house she had lived in for 31 years, through the front hall with its 14-year accumulation of family photographs that she didn't stop to look at, out through the garage that still held her gardening tools organized on the pegboard the way she'd arranged them in 2009, and she got into her car. The drive back to Jennifer's apartment took 45 minutes. She did not cry. She did not play the radio. She did not rehearse arguments or compose speeches or cycle through the specific catalog of grievances she'd been quietly cataloging for years. She drove in a silence so complete it felt external rather than internal, as if the noise of the previous 31 years had finally stopped mid-frequency. And what was left was not emptiness, but pure acoustic space. The kind in which you can finally hear what has always been underneath the noise. She thought about the cobalt blue vase. She had bought it at a gallery in Banff on the morning of their 28th anniversary, while David was still asleep in the hotel room. She'd seen it in the window and known immediately, the kind of knowing that requires no deliberation. She'd walked in, bought it without hesitation, carried it back to the hotel wrapped in newspaper. David had looked at it over breakfast and said it was an unusual color choice, but he supposed it was her decision. She had put it in the center of the kitchen island when they got home, and it had lived there for 4 years. And every morning when she made coffee, she saw it. Not because David approved of it, because it was hers. Christine had been arranging flowers in it. Christine's hands had been in that vase. Sarah drove past the Tim Hortons without stopping, past the school, past the church. What arrived in her chest, in those 45 minutes, was not grief. She'd been grieving for 3 weeks already. The particular grinding grief of recognizing that a life you'd built was not what you'd believed it to be. That the structure you'd been maintaining was hollow in a way you'd chosen not to examine. That grief was old enough already. What arrived now was something else. Something that had the quality of weight releasing rather than weight arriving. She had been replaced. And in being replaced, she had been, paradoxically, freed from the obligation to remain. There was a conversation she had been putting off for 11 years, not with David, with herself. The question she had never quite allowed herself to finish was this: if I could design a life from the beginning, with no accumulated obligation to anyone else's idea of what it should look like, what would I actually choose? She had started the question at least a dozen times over the years, usually in the rare solitary moments, long baths, early morning before anyone else was awake, the 40 minutes she sometimes had in the car before picking up Emma from a school event. She'd start to feel her way toward an answer, and then she'd hear David's car in the drive, or Marcus would call from upstairs, or her own voice would interrupt with a version of, "Don't be self-indulgent, we have a good life, don't destabilize something that works." And the question would fold itself back up, patient as a letter that knows it will eventually be read. Driving back to Jennifer's apartment on that cold October Thursday for the first time in 11 years, she let the question unfold all the way. The answer didn't arrive in words. It arrived in images: a coast, water, light on water, a room that was small and entirely her own, mornings that began with her own desires rather than other people's schedules, a version of herself that she recognized as younger, not in age, but in the specific quality of aliveness that she'd carried before she learned to route all of her energy outward. The images were specific and vivid in a way that told her they hadn't been imagined on the drive. They'd been stored, carefully, against exactly this moment. She drove directly to a realtor's office on 17th Avenue that she had passed approximately 8,000 times and never once entered. By Monday morning, the rental property her mother had left her, a small bungalow in Inglewood, the kind of house that had been in families for generations, the kind that generated $2 and $100 a month in steady, reliable income, was listed for sale. By Wednesday afternoon, she had accepted an offer of $487,000, closing in 23 days. By Friday evening, she had liquidated her RRSP, $73,000 in investments, converted to cash. She paid the tax penalty without flinching. She had done the math. She was 49 years into a 52-year relationship with practicality, and she was done with the math. Her sister Jennifer stood in her Inglewood apartment watching all of this with the expression of someone watching a controlled demolition from a safe distance, not certain the distance is safe. Jennifer had a master's degree in social work and a therapist's tendency to diagnose emotional states with clinical precision. "You're making permanent decisions based on temporary emotions," she said, which was both accurate and completely beside the point. Sarah looked up from her laptop where she was researching ferry schedules. "They're not temporary," she said. "They've been accumulating for 31 years. They just finally got heavy enough." Jennifer sat down across from her at the small kitchen table. She had the expression she used when she was deciding whether to speak as a sister or as a professional, weighing which version of herself was more useful in the room. "I know you're hurting. I know that kitchen was... What you saw was devastating, Sarah. I'm not minimizing that." "You're about to, though," Sarah said. "I'm about to say that major life decisions made in acute emotional pain have a way of saving people?" Sarah closed the laptop. "Because that's what this feels like. Not a decision made in pain, a decision that's been waiting for enough pain to give me permission to make it." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. She looked at her sister with the careful attention she'd learned to pay to the people sitting across from her in professional contexts, the attention that goes past the surface performance to what was being held underneath. "What are you looking for?" "Not a fresh start," Sarah said immediately. "I know what that sounds like, and it isn't that. I'm not trying to become someone different. I'm trying to find out if the person I was before this house and this marriage is still accessible. If she waited." She paused. "The person who wanted things for herself, who had plans that weren't organized around anyone else's schedule. I want to know if she's still there." Jennifer looked at her for a long moment. "Where are you going?" "West, the coast. I need water. I need somewhere that doesn't already know who I am supposed to be." Jennifer pressed her lips together, and Sarah watched her make the decision to set down the clinical frame. What arrived in its place was something simpler and more ancient. A sister who understood, even if she couldn't follow. "If you're going," Jennifer said finally, "then go properly. Don't leave in a way you'll have to apologize for." "I won't apologize. I know, that's actually what I mean." She came back the next morning and found Jennifer at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee and a look that meant she'd been awake for hours making a decision. Jennifer pushed 1 mug across the table. "What I didn't say last night," Jennifer said, "is that I've watched you disappear for a long time. Not all at once. Not in any way anyone could point to and call dramatic. Just gradually, the way things go quiet under snow. The Sarah I grew up with wanted things fiercely. She had opinions about everything. She argued. She took up space in a room. She wrapped both hands around her mug. And then somewhere in the middle of raising Emma and Marcus and running that house, the Sarah who argued went somewhere quiet. And I kept waiting for her to come back, and she didn't." A pause. "Whatever you're doing, the selling, the leaving, I think that Sarah is the one making these decisions, and I think she's been waiting a very long time to make them." Sarah held this. Then, "Why didn't you say something? In all those years?" "Because you seemed fine. You were competent and organized and the family worked. What was I going to say? That you seemed too capable?" Jennifer shook her head. "And because you would have told me you were fine. You'd convinced yourself." "Yes," Sarah said. "I had." They finished the coffee without talking much. But when Sarah left, Jennifer stood at the door of her apartment for a moment longer than necessary, and the look on her face was something between grief and relief. The look of someone watching a bridge finally built to a place you'd been afraid to reach. What she was converting was not just financial assets. Every property she sold, every investment she liquidated, every Calgary telephone number she'd memorized by rote was becoming something she could carry. Possessions were becoming freedom at a conversion rate she could actually calculate, and she found she could calculate it very clearly. Every asset sold was a severed tie. Every dollar liquidated was a locked door opening. She researched with the focus of someone who had been handed a map they hadn't known they were looking for. She didn't want a city. She didn't want opportunity or stimulation or a fresh start in a different version of the life she'd had. She wanted medicine, restoration, a place that existed specifically to repair broken things. She found it the way you find things you needed before you knew you were looking. Salt Spring Island, in the Gulf Islands off the coast of British Columbia. A place where artists and healers had gathered for decades, drawn by something in the light, the forest, the particular quality of air over cold Pacific water. Small enough to allow invisibility, beautiful enough to insist on being seen. She had never been west of the Rockies except for one conference trip to Vancouver 19 years ago, when she'd spent most of her time in hotel meeting rooms and never once saw the ocean. 23 days after walking out of her kitchen, Sarah landed in Vancouver, took a seaplane over the islands. Her first seaplane, the kind of small life first that arrives when you stop protecting your comfort, and looked down at the world from an altitude she'd never occupied before. The Gulf Islands spread below her in the pewter water like a scattered handful of something precious, dark green and irregular, each one rimmed with exposed rock and arbutus trees and the particular mystery of land you can only reach by water. She pressed her forehead to the cold window and felt the vibration of the small engine in her sternum, and thought, I have never seen the world from here before. I have been on this earth for 52 years, and I have never seen it from this angle. And the thought was not melancholy. It was the specific exhilaration of discovering that the map you'd been given was smaller than the actual territory. She signed a 1-year lease on a 650-square-foot cottage near Ganges. Cedar walls, a wood stove, windows that faced the harbor. Absolutely nothing that held any memory of the life she had just left. She stood in the middle of the empty cottage on her first night and listened to the silence. It was the loudest she'd ever heard. For 31 years, her ambient environment had been other people's needs, the hum of David's television preferences, the particular frequency of children's sleep and waking and wanting, the social maintenance of a family's endless calendar. Even in the quiet moments, there had been a background signal, other people's breathing. The house's acknowledgement of being occupied by multiple lives. The cottage offered nothing. Wind in the fir trees. Rain occasionally, which on Salt Spring arrived with a different quality than Calgary rain. Softer, more deliberate, as if it had traveled a long way and intended to stay. The harbor seal who barked most evenings from somewhere south of the dock. The first month tasted like failure. She woke disoriented, not knowing which wall held the window. She reached for routines that didn't exist here. She made grocery lists for a kitchen that had no established order, arranged her few possessions and rearranged them, looking for the right place for each thing, and understanding that she was also, in a more fundamental way, looking for the right place for herself. Some mornings, she sat at the window with her coffee and felt the full weight of what she had done. She had sold her mother's house. She had dissolved the financial architecture of a 31-year marriage with the efficiency of someone clearing a filing cabinet. She had moved to an island she had never visited, in a province she barely knew, to a cottage smaller than her Calgary living room. She was 52 years old, and she did not know her nearest neighbor's name or which road led to the ferry, or whether the wood stove needed a specific kind of wood, or whether the noise the dock made at high tide was normal or a sign of something structural. She did not know how to do this. That was the truth of those mornings. And then she would watch the harbor seal arrive. He came most evenings just at dusk, and sometimes in the morning too. a dark, glossy head appearing in the water 100 feet from the dock, regarding the cottage with an expression of complete equanimity. He had been here before her. He would be here after. He had no opinion about her uncertainty. He surfaced and dove and surfaced again. And the harbor held him the same way it held the herons and the kayaks and the light, without preference, without judgment, without the expectation that anything in particular should happen next. She started to find this useful as a model. She drove into Ganges village that first week feeling conspicuously new, the way newcomers do when a community is small enough to register each face. The village had a farmer's market on Saturdays that smelled of damp wool and fresh bread, and something aromatic she couldn't identify, until a vendor told her it was dried lavender from a farm on the north end. She bought goat cheese, a jar of honey with a handwritten label, a potted rosemary plant she had no particular plan for but needed in the same instinctive way she'd needed the cobalt vase in the Banff Gallery window. She walked the harbor path and watched the float planes come and go, watched the small ferries move between islands, watched the light on the water change as the clouds moved. Light that was entirely different from prairie light, deeper and more refractive, filtered through ocean moisture and Douglas fir canopy into something that felt less like illumination and more like revelation. She ate alone for the first time in years, without feeling the absence as a judgment. She read at the table, a habit David had always found antisocial, and no one in the cottage commented on it. She furnished the cottage slowly, deliberately, not filling it the way you fill space to prove it's occupied, but choosing each object with the care of someone who had finally been given the authority to choose. A reading chair positioned to face the water, so every morning began with the harbor and the herons and the particular silver light of the Pacific coast. A small table she painted cobalt blue, a color David had always described as too intense for interior spaces, a description she understood now as having been about her, not the color. Bookshelves. Art from the island galleries, an oil painting of arbutus trees, their red-orange bark peeling back in long strips like skin in the process of becoming something new. She looked at those arbutus trees a lot that first month. She thought about the bark. By month 3, the silence had stopped feeling aggressive and started feeling like permission. And in month 4, something unexpected happened. She got hungry. Not for food or for company or for the reassurance of familiar voices. Hungry for information. For the raw material of learning, the kind of learning that has no practical application, no return on investment, no contribution to anyone else's schedule or well-being. The kind she'd been promising herself for 30 years and deferring with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to confuse other people's urgency with her own priorities. She enrolled in a pottery class at the Island Arts Center and discovered that clay responds to attention in a way that is almost startling. That the same hands that had managed other people's lives for 3 decades could press a soft lump of earth into a shape that had never existed before, could give it walls and a hollow center and a function, could make something that was entirely and only hers. Her first bowls were lopsided. Her first mugs leaked. She kept them all, arranged on the cobalt blue table. Evidence. The instructor was a woman named Greta, 70s, Swedish-born, with hands that looked like they'd been making pots since before Sarah was born. On Sarah's 3rd session, Greta came to stand behind her and watched her work the wheel for a full minute without speaking. "You're fighting it," Greta finally said. "I'm trying to center it." "You're trying to force it to center. There's a difference." Greta's hands came over Sarah's, adjusting the pressure. Less vertical, more lateral, the force distributed differently. The clay, which had been wobbling, suddenly stilled. "You feel that?" Sarah felt it. The sudden cooperation of the material, the moment the clay stopped resisting and started participating. "Yes. You can't push clay into shape. You can only invite it. The centering happens when you stop insisting." Greta stepped back. "It's the same with most things." Sarah worked in silence for a while after that. and understood she was being told something that had nothing to do with pottery. By month 5, she had made 47 objects. She had thrown out none of them. The shelf above the blue table held the full chronology: the lumpy early bowls, the improving middle mugs, the things that had cracked in the kiln and been kept anyway because the crack told a story about pressure and heat that she wasn't willing to erase. She had started to think of the shelf as a kind of autobiography. Not the official one, not the version with the university degrees and the marriage certificate and the 31 years of competent, invisible management, but the honest one. The one that began with failure and recorded the specific, imperfect process of becoming capable at something she had chosen for no reason except that she wanted to. She had also begun to know people on the island. Not in the exhaustive, socially managed way she'd known people in Calgary. The school committees and the neighborhood associations and David's colleagues and their wives. The layered social obligations of a life built around other people's networks. These were simpler connections. Greta, who sometimes stayed after class to talk about objects, the history of clay, the women who had made pots in every civilization ever excavated, the way pottery is always the first evidence archaeologists find of a culture because it survives everything. A woman named Delia who ran the lavender farm on the North End and sometimes appeared at the Saturday market with a look of settled contentment that Sarah was only beginning to recognize as achievable. A retired fisheries biologist named Tom, who walked the harbor path every morning at 7 and had started nodding to her in a way that eventually became conversation. The gradual way conversations begin on islands where the same people cross the same paths in all seasons. These were not the connections of convenience or obligation. They were the connections you make when you have only your actual self to offer. No role, no title, no institutional context, no social currency accumulated over decades in a single place. People knew her as the woman from Calgary who made pottery and walked the East Path in all weather. It was enough. It was, she was beginning to understand, more honest than being known as David Mitchell's wife, or Emma and Marcus's mother, or the woman who organized the neighborhood Christmas party for 17 years running. She was simply Sarah. In a way, she had not been simply Sarah since before she was anyone's anything. She joined a nature journaling workshop and learned the names of trees she'd been walking past without registering. Douglas fir, western red cedar, big leaf maple with its enormous leaves going gold, Gary oak, gnarled and ancient, growing on the rocky outcrops above the harbor. She bought a field guide to Pacific Northwest birds and began carrying it on her morning walks, learning to tell species apart by call rather than appearance. The high, thin whistle of a varied thrush, the cascading song of a winter wren, the difference between a song sparrow and a house finch in the exact quality of their phrasing. She memorized Mary Oliver poems. She studied the history of women's property rights in Canada and felt a retroactive anger that surprised her with its heat. She read memoirs by women who had remade themselves after 50 and found them instructive in a way that had nothing to do with technique. The hunger felt ancient, like her mind had been quietly starving for 3 decades, and was only now, in the silence of the cottage, recognizing the depth of the deprivation. She was 6 months in when the phone rang. Not Emma's weekly check-in. Not Jennifer with concern in her voice. An unknown number with a British Columbia area code. And when she answered, a man identified himself as a property manager named Daniel Ray, calling about the cottage at Ganges Harbor. "I want to check in with you about your tenancy," he said. His voice had a careful quality, the kind that precedes difficult information. "There's something I should have told you when you signed the lease, and legally I probably should have disclosed it, and I didn't, and I've been thinking about it for months." Sarah put down the mug she was holding, one of her own, lopsided, the glaze a deep ocean green, and gave the phone her full attention. "The woman who owned this property originally," Daniel said. "The woman who left it in trust and whose trust technically sold you, Well, leased you. This cottage. Her name was Eleanor Marsh. She died 10 years ago. A pause that Sarah didn't fill. The thing is, he continued, Eleanor Marsh was officially declared dead by her family in 2014. But this is complicated. The declaration happened when she'd been missing for a year. There was never a body found. She simply left one day. Left her house in Victoria, left her career as a marine biologist, left everything, and was never seen again. Her family had her declared dead after the search was called off. They inherited her estate, which included this property. The trust I manage was set up in her name before she disappeared, and it continued generating income for a local wildlife foundation she'd started. Sarah looked out at the harbor. The light was doing the thing it did in the afternoon in October, turning the water pewter and copper. But about 3 months after you signed your lease, Daniel said, we received a letter from Eleanor Marsh, postmarked from somewhere in New Mexico. Alive. She wrote to say she was glad the cottage was being used by someone who seemed to be taking care of it, that she'd checked on it herself before she left, and she'd hoped it would go to someone who needed it. The silence stretched between them, over hundreds of miles of coastline, and Sarah felt something move through her that she couldn't immediately name. She knew about me, Sarah said finally. She mentioned you by name, Daniel said. Somehow. I don't know how she found out. She wrote that she hoped you were finding what you came looking for. And she asked me to tell you, when the time felt right, that the blue arbutus trees on the east path were her favorites too. She said if you'd found those trees, you'd understand. Sarah was quiet for a moment longer. Does her family know she's alive? I contacted a lawyer about that. The situation is complicated. Legally, she's still a declared decedent in British Columbia. The estate has been distributed. Notifying her family could trigger a cascade of legal processes she apparently chose to avoid. His voice carried something careful, something that might have been discomfort or might have been admiration. My professional obligation is narrow. The letter didn't ask me to do anything except convey the message about the trees. Thank you, Sarah said, for telling me. After she hung up, she sat at the blue table for a very long time. The harbor shifted through 3 distinct qualities of light in the time she sat there. The pewter afternoon, the brief gold of a clearing sky, the gray-blue dusk settling over the water. She didn't move through any of it. She was doing the kind of thinking that requires absolute physical stillness, the kind where the body understands it needs to get out of the way. She sat with this information. A woman had lived in this cottage before her. A woman who had, at some point in her life, looked around at the architecture of her existence and found it unrecognizable as her own. A woman who had left everything: career, family, identification, the entire official record of her personhood, and disappeared. Who had lived somewhere in the country for a decade under circumstances Sarah could only imagine. Who had, despite everything, kept her eye on the cottage near Ganges. Who had known, somehow, that it had been passed to someone who needed it. She walked the east path that afternoon for the first time, past the cluster of arbutus trees she'd painted in her journal 6 times without knowing whose eyes had seen them first. The bark peeled from their trunks in long, papery strips, revealing the smooth, coppery wood beneath. The new growth always visible under the old, the process of renewal built into the architecture of the tree itself. She stood there until the light failed. She never found Eleanor Marsh. She looked quietly, over the following months, searched the name, found the missing persons report from 2013, filed by a sister in Victoria. Found the Royal Canadian Mounted Police case file summary, available through access to information requests, which described an orderly departure. Car left at the ferry terminal. Bank accounts emptied in the preceding 2 weeks. Lease terminated with proper notice. Professional obligations completed and handed off. Not an emergency. A plan. The declaration of death had followed after a year-long search produced no evidence of violence or accident. She found the Wildlife Foundation's tax records and the marine biology publications from the 1990s, with Eleanor Marsh's name on them. Papers about Pacific gray whales, about migration patterns, about what ocean temperature changes were doing to feeding grounds. The work of someone who paid close attention to things that moved through the world in ways most people never noticed. She found a photograph on an archived university website. A woman with gray-streaked hair and salt-weathered skin, and eyes that looked directly at the camera with a particular quality of attention that Sarah recognized without being able to explain why. She never contacted her. Some permissions are given wordlessly, through objects and space, and a letter to a man named Daniel Ray. The right response to that kind of gift is not a thank you note. But she thought about Eleanor Marsh often. She thought about the specificity of her disappearance, the orderliness of it, the banked accounts and terminated lease and completed professional obligations. A woman who had not run. A woman who had arranged her exit with the same methodical care she'd once brought to her career, who had understood that leaving properly is its own form of respect, for the life you're leaving and for the one you're building. There was something Sarah found more instructive in that than in any of the memoirs she'd been reading. Eleanor Marsh had not been rescued. She had not been helped or counseled or guided toward insight by a good therapist or a supportive family. She had simply looked at her life clearly, made her calculations, and gone. Alone. Into the complete unknown. And a decade later, she was alive somewhere in New Mexico. Alive enough to write letters. Alive enough to check on a cottage she'd loved. Alive enough to recognize from whatever distance she'd put between herself and her former life that another woman had arrived at the same harbor for the same reasons, and to send word, "I see you. I was here first. You're going to be all right." Sarah wrote this in her journal. She wrote it carefully, in the good pen she'd started using for things she wanted to keep. And then she walked the east path to the arbutus grove and stood in the afternoon light until she felt the truth of it settle into her body. She understood something after that, something that settled into her bones and stayed. She had not stumbled onto this island by accident. She had followed the same internal compass that had guided Eleanor Marsh to this same harbor, this same view, this same peeling arbutus bark. The compass exists in women who have been too long arranged to suit someone else's navigational needs. When it finally gets to point where it wants to point, it points true. It was the following month, month 7, when Emma called with the news about David. Heart attack, 2 stents, stable, but serious. Emma's voice had that careful quality of a person holding several things simultaneously and trying not to drop any of them. Sarah was in the cottage when the call came. She sat very still in her reading chair, watching a great blue heron fish in the shallows just past the dock. The heron did not look up. The heron was attending to the water, patient and absolute in its stillness. "Is he asking for me?" Sarah said. The pause before Emma answered told her everything. "He hasn't asked for anything specific. He's pretty out of it still from the anesthesia. But Mom, I thought you should know." What Emma was not saying, "Come home." What Emma was hoping she would infer from the call, that this is the kind of crisis that overrides everything else. What Emma was perhaps testing, in the gentle way that children of parents in difficulty learn to test, whether the woman her mother had become was still responsive to the old emergency protocols. "Thank you for telling me," Sarah said. "Please keep me updated on his condition." Emma's voice shifted. "That's it? You're not coming?" "Emma, does Christine know?" Another pause. "She's the one who called 911. She's been at the hospital the whole time." "Then he has someone," Sarah said. "Not cold, not performative, simply accurate. He made sure of that." She hung up and sat with the weight of it. She felt it. She felt the pull of the old habits, the reflex that had been trained into her over 3 decades. The reach toward other people's emergencies, the automatic recalibration of her own schedule to accommodate everyone else's crisis. It was real. She felt it the way you feel a phantom limb, the neural pathway still intact, the impulse fully present. arriving at a hand that was no longer there. She watched the heron. Over the following weeks, the messages arrived with the regularity of a campaign. Emma with updates, David recovering, angioplasty healing, rehabilitation scheduled, Christine managing his care. Marcus with a terse email that used the phrase really classy, and the implication that David's proximity to death made Sarah's absence a moral failure. David's sister, Helen, through Jennifer. Tell Sarah her absence speaks volumes. Each message was a hook. Each one was designed, consciously or not, to catch in the softest part of her and pull. They were written in the language she'd been taught to respond to: obligation, guilt, the suggestion that her value as a human being was measured by her availability to other people's suffering. She read every one of them. She felt the tug of each one, acknowledged it the way you acknowledge a scar. This was real. This was part of her. This is what all those years had built. She noticed the specific quality of each pull. Helen's message had the hot, righteous quality of someone who had always found Sarah useful and was now alarmed at the prospect of losing access to that usefulness. Marcus's email had the cold, performative quality of a man who was genuinely frightened for his father and needed someone to blame for the fear. Emma's updates had something different. Not hooks so much as offerings. Information delivered without instruction, without expectation. Updates that trusted Sarah to know what to do with them. She filed this distinction away. It would be important later. And then she deleted them. She turned off read receipts. She let calls go to voicemail. She allowed herself one check of messages per day. At 5 p.m., when she was finished with whatever she was making in the pottery studio, and could approach other people's urgency from the stable ground of a completed afternoon. The world did not end. David recovered. Emma and Marcus managed their anxiety. Jennifer stopped forwarding messages after Sarah asked her to. What Sarah discovered in those weeks was something so simple it should have been obvious. Other people's crises were capable of continuing without her. The emergency infrastructure she had believed she provided, the logistics, the emotional management, the physical presence, had been replaced by Christine, then by David's own capacity to manage, then simply by time. The crises resolved. The pain was felt and endured without her administration. She had not been necessary. She had been convenient. The distinction felt like finally reading a document she'd been handed 30 years ago without ever breaking the seal. She wrote that sentence in her journal. She wrote it, and then she sat with it for 2 days before writing the next line, which was, "And I chose convenience for myself, too." Because that was also true. It would have been easier, in all the ways that matter to the exhausted and the practical, to have stayed. To have managed the situation the way she'd managed everything else, with competence and composure and the skilled erasure of her own reaction. She had done that so many times before. She had swallowed so many afternoons of feeling invisible, of reaching for a conversation David was no longer having, of suggesting a trip or a book or a change in their routine and watching the suggestion dissolve into the ambient air of his inattention. She could have swallowed this too. The kitchen scene, the photograph on the refrigerator, the 12 words. She could have managed them into the same quiet place where all the other ungovernable feelings lived. The fact that she hadn't was not an accident. It was not a spontaneous eruption of emotion that bypassed her will. The cashmere sweater, the October cold, the drive past the Tim Hortons. Something in her had already decided, before she put the key in the door, that the next thing she found unbearable would be the last. Some part of her had been waiting for the moment to be clear enough. The photograph on the refrigerator had been clear enough. And what that meant was that she bore some responsibility for the decision she'd made. Not guilt, but ownership. She hadn't been forced out. She had chosen. The choosing had been waiting in her long enough that when the moment came, it arrived fully formed. She found this more comforting than the alternative. The alternative was that she had been helpless, overtaken by circumstances, a passive object propelled by external force. She was not that. She had never been that. Even in the most invisible years of the marriage, she had been an agent. She had simply been an agent whose energy had been entirely directed outward, toward the management of everything except herself. She was redirecting now. That was what this was. She wrote it in the journal in the good pen, underlined it once, and closed the book. Outside, the harbor seal surfaced and dove and surfaced again, indifferent and present, doing exactly what it had always done in exactly the place it had always done it. She watched him and felt, for the first time since the kitchen scene, something uncomplicated move through her. Not joy, something quieter. The sensation of being correctly oriented, of facing the direction she actually needed to face. In month 11, Emma came to the island. She arrived on the afternoon ferry looking like she was carrying something heavy and had decided on the boat ride over that she was going to put it down. A backpack, worn hiking boots, an expression Sarah recognized from Emma's childhood, the look that preceded confession. They walked the beach at low tide, past tide pools that reflected the cloud cover, past ribbons of kelp and moon snails and the particular mineral smell of exposed rock. "I need to apologize," Emma said. She said it to the water, then turned to say it to Sarah. "I didn't understand what you were doing. I thought you were running. I thought you'd given up and left and were waiting for someone to come convince you to come back." "What changed?" Sarah asked. Emma looked down at the sand. Christine moved into the house, fully, her furniture, her pictures, her coffee station in the east corner of the kitchen. A pause. "And I watched how Dad treated her. And it was exactly the same. The phone out at dinner. The decisions made without asking. The way he'd be talking to her and then just stop listening, mid-sentence, like the thought had more value than its completion." She picked up a sand dollar, turned it over, set it back. "I realized you didn't leave Dad. You left a pattern, and he found someone else to run the pattern with." Sarah felt something unknot in her chest, not the satisfaction of being right. She'd been right for years, and it hadn't felt like anything. This was different. This was being seen clearly by someone who had needed to develop new eyes to do it. "I'm sorry I made you feel guilty for saving yourself," Emma said. "You're allowed to have a life." They stayed 3 days. Sarah showed Emma the pottery, the good pieces and the disasters, the evolution from month 2 to month 11 visible on a single shelf. She showed her Greta's instructions about centering the clay, about the difference between forcing and inviting. Emma held one of the early lopsided mugs in both hands and looked at it for a long time. "You kept them," Emma said. "The bad ones. Especially the bad ones. They're evidence that I didn't know how to do this at the beginning. That there was a beginning." Emma set the mug back carefully, with the reverence you use for something fragile and deliberate. "I would have thrown them out, hidden them." "I know," Sarah said. "That's something you learned from watching me. From watching me hide the things that weren't perfect yet." She paused. "You don't have to do that." Emma looked at her mother with an expression that had something naked in it. The face of a person revising a long-held understanding and feeling the vertigo of the revision. "That's the apology I actually owe you. Not the one about the phone calls. This one." They hiked to Mount Erskine in the gray November light. Emma photographed the arbutus trees for 2 full hours, asked Sarah why she'd painted her table blue, listened to the answer with a stillness that felt like respect. On the ferry dock, Emma held her with the force of someone who understood what they were holding. "You look happy," Emma said. "Actually, genuinely happy. And I don't think I've seen you content. I've seen you competent. I've seen you so good at everything that it looked like joy. But this is different." Sarah thought about the arbutus trees, the bark peeling to show what was beneath. "It is different," she said. Marcus reached out 3 weeks later. A short email. "Emma said you have a pottery studio. Can I visit sometime?" It was 6 sentences long, which for Marcus constituted an emotional soliloquy. She wrote back, "Yes, here's when the ferry runs." And then, in month 14, 2 months past the original 1-year lease she'd already quietly extended, David called. Not through Emma, not through Jennifer as intermediary. David himself at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, which was when she always answered the phone. "I owe you an apology," he said, without preamble. Several apologies. A full catalog of apologies. Sarah waited. Christine left. He said it without self-pity, just the fact of it. It turns out she wasn't interested in cardiac rehabilitation schedules and canceled travel plans and a man who needed someone to manage his recovery. And when she was gone, I was alone in that house, and I started actually thinking. Finally, thinking. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Something scraped down to its essentials. I did the same thing to her that I did to you. I treated her like infrastructure, like someone whose value was in the function they performed rather than in the person they were. She saw it faster than you did, probably because she didn't love me the way you did, and loving someone gives them a much longer runway for this kind of thing. "Yes," Sarah said. "Emma said you're doing pottery, hiking, learning birds." A pause. "She said you seem like a completely different person." "I'm not a different person," Sarah said. "I'm the same person. I just stopped being arranged to fit someone else's space." Another pause. Longer. "Is there any possibility, any chance at all, that you'd be willing to have a conversation? Not about coming back. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking if you'd be willing to talk to me. Really talk, the way we never did." Sarah looked around the cottage. The blue table, her lopsided mugs with the green glaze, the arbutus painting above the wood stove. The field guide open on the windowsill to a page of thrushes. "I'm willing to talk," she said, "on conditions. Anything. You come here. You come to where I am, on my terms and in my space. You come to listen, not to convince, not to negotiate, not to propose any kind of arrangement. You come to understand what happened. That's the entire agenda." "Yes," David said. "I'll let you know when." She didn't call for 3 weeks. Not as punishment. She'd graduated from punishment, which requires maintaining connection to the thing you want to punish. She waited because she needed certainty, and certainty required consultation with the woman she'd been seeing on the island, the therapist whose office was above the bakery in Ganges, and who specialized in helping people rebuild identity after loss. "What do you want from this conversation?" the therapist asked. Sarah thought about it. Not the reflexive answer, the social answer, the answer that would reflect well. The actual answer. "I want him to understand the full accounting," she said. "Not an apology in general. Not sorry for being a bad husband in a generic way. I want him to understand specifically what was taken, what it cost, what it looked like from the inside. And I want to find out whether he's capable of actually seeing me now, seeing the actual person, or whether he's here because he needs someone in the role again, and I'm the most familiar candidate." The therapist nodded. "And if it's the latter?" "Then the conversation ends, and we agree on how to be cordial at family events." David came on the same ferry Emma had taken on a gray December morning with sleet in the forecast. Sarah picked him up at the Fulford Harbor terminal. He looked smaller than she remembered. Thinner. The heart attack had taken something structural from him, redistributed some fundamental weight. He'd never been good at managing his own physical needs. That had been her domain for 3 decades. And it showed now in the slight uncertainty of his movements, the way he looked at the cottage when they arrived as if calculating what she'd been doing in it without him. She did not make coffee without being asked. She did not perform hospitality. They sat at the blue table. She began with the kitchen. She began with the journal, with the 6,247 school lunches, with the specific and ordinary mathematics of what she had contributed to his daily life. She was not angry, exactly. She'd processed the anger in her first months on the island, had let it become something cleaner and more useful, something with edges rather than heat. She was precise. She cataloged his mother's 18 months of terminal illness, during which Sarah had managed the care facility communication, the insurance documentation, the medication schedules, all while David maintained his work schedule because he said it couldn't be disrupted. She described the Costa Rica trip he'd booked without consulting her, the one he'd been so proud of, the surprise, arriving while she'd been saving for a writing workshop she'd never mentioned, because she'd known it would be assessed as impractical and set aside. She described the thousands of small dismissals, the conversations he'd ended mid-sentence to check his phone, the opinions offered and received in silence, the gradual sense of not being listened to that had calcified, over 3 decades, into a certainty that she was furniture. David listened. He did not look away. He made no defensive movements, no crossed arms, no verbal interruptions, no counter-evidence. At one point, tears came down his face with a simplicity that surprised her. No performance of weeping, just water on skin. When she finished, there was a long silence. Outside, the sleet had arrived. It moved sideways past the windows in thin gray curtains. The wood stove ticked and breathed. The harbor, just visible past the dock, had disappeared into weather. "In 31 years," she said, "did you know I wanted to take a writing workshop?" David looked down at the table. "No." "Did you know I wanted the condo we looked at in 2004, the one near the river, instead of this house?" "You never said." "I know I never said. I'm asking whether you ever noticed that I wanted something." She waited. "Did you ever ask what I wanted in 31 years, when it wasn't directly connected to managing something for you or the children?" The silence before his answer was its own answer. It went on long enough to be undeniable, long enough for both of them to feel the full dimensions of what it represented. "No," he said. "I don't think I did." "I know," Sarah said. "I know you didn't. And for 20 of those years, I told myself you were simply busy, that the children needed so much, and the career demanded so much, and I had the time and the capacity, and so of course it made sense for me to carry the domestic weight. I told myself that was a fair arrangement between adults who had made different contributions." She paused. "And for the last 11 years, I knew it wasn't that simple, and I said nothing, because saying it would have required acknowledging that I'd been living in a diminishment, and that acknowledgement seemed more frightening than the diminishment itself." David absorbed this. "No, I didn't. And Christine? I did the same thing, just faster. She saw it in a year what took you 31. Turns out when you fail to actually see a person, they eventually stop being visible on purpose." Sarah felt something she had not anticipated. Not vindication, not satisfaction. Something softer and more complicated. The thing that arrives when someone who hurt you finally looks at the shape of what they did. Compassion, not forgiveness, which requires time and distance that she hadn't yet traveled, but the recognition of a person seeing their own damage clearly, perhaps for the first time. "I don't know what this becomes," she said. "I'm not returning to Calgary to live. I'm not returning to the marriage we had. The person who managed that house and that marriage and that version of our life doesn't exist anymore. I didn't kill her. She became something else. She's sitting at this table." "I know," David said. "Emma told me. She wasn't gentle about it." "Good." She made coffee then, because she wanted coffee. And because the conversation had arrived somewhere that allowed it without meaning anything particular. They sat at the blue table for another 2 hours, talking. Actually talking, in the way she'd described to the therapist. He asked about the island, about the pottery, about the birds she'd been learning. He listened to the answers with an attention she hadn't seen from him since the early years of their marriage. and she couldn't tell if it was new or recovered, whether he'd always been capable of it and had simply stopped exercising the capacity, or whether the heart attack and the loss of Christine and the silence of his empty house had rebuilt something that had atrophied. She wasn't certain it mattered. She was certain only that she would find out slowly, without rushing, without concession. He took the last ferry back to Fulford Harbor as the sleet finally arrived, turning the harbor silver gray in the early dark. She watched his rental car pull away from the dock and felt something she hadn't expected: the quiet. Not the silence of abandonment. Not the aggressive silence of that first month. The silence that had demanded explanation of her. This was the silence she'd chosen. The silence she'd built. The silence that was hers. What followed in the next months was careful. They spoke weekly, Tuesdays at 7. David visited every 6 weeks. Ferry, cottage, the blue table, walks in weather she'd learned to read like a language. She took him to the arbutus grove on the East Path, watched him try to understand what she saw there, watched him look at the peeling bark with honest confusion and then, slowly, with something closer to comprehension. He took a pottery class at a community center in Calgary. He was genuinely terrible at it in a way that made her laugh. And the laugh, when it came, had the quality of something that had been held in a cold place for a long time and was remembering its original temperature. He sent photographs of his disasters. She sent photographs of her improvements. A conversation was being conducted in misshapen clay. He also unexpectedly began writing. Not formally, not with any ambition toward publication or audience. He had started keeping a journal. He told her in one of their Tuesday calls, a little self-consciously, the way people admit to things they expect to be met with sarcasm. He wrote about the Calgary house in its emptiness after she left. About the months before his heart attack, the tightness in his chest he'd dismissed for a week before it became undeniable. About his father, who had been a man of elaborate emotional silence and whose example had been, David was realizing in retrospect, the primary instruction manual for his own silences. He didn't read her passages. He simply told her the journal existed, and something in the telling felt like the most honest thing he'd said to her in years. Not a disclosure of content, but of process. The acknowledgement that he was, finally, in conversation with himself. She thought about Eleanor Marsh's marine biology papers, the meticulous recording of observation, the careful language of a scientist who had spent her career watching things move through the world and writing down what she saw. She thought about how that same precision, turned inward, had eventually produced a woman methodical enough to plan her own disappearance down to the last cleared account and filed obligation. And she thought about David in his Calgary house, writing badly in a journal, and felt something that was not love exactly, not anymore, but was perhaps a version of the regard you have for someone who is, at last, beginning the work. She did not say any of this to him. Some recognitions are private, but she received his next Tuesday call with a quality of attention that he noticed, she could tell. He paused mid-sentence and said, "You're listening differently," and she said, "Yes," and left it at that. Emma and Marcus came to the island with their own ferry regularity. Emma brought a sketchbook and drew the harbor from the cottage windows. Marcus brought his fiancée Priya and watched his mother lead a nature journaling workshop with an expression Sarah recognized as recalibration. The process of updating the image of a parent to include a dimension the child had never previously observed. Sarah flew to Calgary 3 times that year. A hotel on Stephen Avenue downtown, near the river. She had dinner with Jennifer in Kensington, walked along the Elbow River at dusk, felt the familiar smell of a city that had once been her entire world, and was now simply a place she had once lived and still loved without needing to return to. She attended school events for the grandchildren she was beginning to know, bought ice cream at the shop near the zoo they'd always taken Emma and Marcus to, gave a keynote speech at a women's professional network event that Jennifer organized, speaking about the specific economics of invisible labor in long-term partnerships, And when people came up to her afterward with wet eyes and tight voices saying I needed to hear that, she understood something about what she'd become. She had become someone who had survived, and who therefore had something to offer. The year she turned 56, she bought the cottage outright. She and David sold the Calgary house. That negotiation was its own long conversation, conducted with more equity than anything in their marriage, and divided the proceeds. Her half, combined with what she'd accumulated through the rental and the sale of the Inglewood bungalow, was enough to own the 650 square feet of cedar walls and harbor-facing windows that had received her when she arrived with nothing but grief and certainty. She signed the deed at a small office in Ganges on a morning when the sun was actually out, which on Salt Spring in February is an event worth noting. The notary, a woman in her 70s with a handshake like a dock worker, said, "Welcome home." The words landed differently than they had in any of the previous contexts where she'd heard them. The first night in Jennifer's apartment after leaving the house, when she'd been too raw to feel welcomed anywhere. The seaplane ride, when the beauty of the islands had been real but provisional. Even the first weeks in the cottage, when she'd been performing habituation rather than feeling it. This was different. This was the legal confirmation of something she already knew in her body, that she had arrived at herself at last, by way of a harbor on a small green island, and that the address on the deed was not just a place, but a fact about who she was now. She drove back to the cottage, made coffee in a mug she'd thrown herself, sat at the blue table, and looked at the harbor for a long time without needing to do anything else. The seal was there, dark head, still water, the February light thin but present on the bay. She raised her mug toward the window in a kind of salute, which she recognized as absurd, and felt the warmth of the coffee through the clay she'd shaped with her own hands, in a room she owned, on land that was hers. She had converted grief into action, action into distance, distance into learning, learning into a self she recognized as her own. The chain of conversions was complete. What remained was the living of the thing she had built. Marcus's wedding was in August, in Calgary, at a venue in the Beltline with long windows and the city's skyline visible past the dance floor. Sarah flew in Thursday, checked into her hotel near the Bow River, spent Friday having breakfast with Emma and Priya's family, and feeling the particular pleasure of meeting people who had heard your name for years, and finally have a face to attach it to. She gave a speech at the reception that she'd been writing in her head for weeks, on paper for 3, and in her heart for the full 4 years since she'd walked out of her kitchen. It was about Marcus as a child, specific memories, the kind that only a mother holds, and about what she hoped for him in partnership, and about what she'd learned, at some personal expense, about the difference between being present in a relationship and being useful in one. She told them that love is not the same as management, that a marriage functions best when both people remain curious about the person they've committed to, and that the greatest risk in any long partnership is not conflict or distance, but familiarity taken to the point of invisibility. The slow erosion of actually seeing one another that happens when you assume you already know everything there is to know. She told them that the most loving thing you can do for the person you've chosen is to keep asking who they are becoming, and to stay genuinely interested in the answer. She told them about a shelf in a cottage on a harbor, about the pottery that recorded a learning, imperfect and complete. She told them that the best marriages she'd seen were the ones in which both people had shelves like that, records of becoming, evidence of change, proof that neither one had stopped growing while the other watched. She told Marcus and Priya that she hoped they would always be slightly surprising to each other, that they would still, at 50, at 60, be capable of doing something that made the other one say, "I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you felt that way. Who are you becoming?" She paused before sitting down and said, "The greatest gift in a partnership is to be truly known. But being truly known requires that you know yourself first. Don't lose yourself in this. Bring your whole self to it, every year, and ask the same of each other." People cried. The good kind of crying, where faces open rather than close. David was there with a woman named Anne who worked in library sciences and had the kind of face that paid close attention to everything happening around her. Sarah watched him talk to Anne across the dinner table and noticed what Emma had described. A different quality of attention. The phone remained in his pocket. He leaned forward when she spoke. He was looking at her, actually looking, the way you look at something you're afraid of losing. It was possible that people could be changed by loss. Sarah had been. It seemed not unreasonable to allow for the same possibility in others. Late in the evening, Emma found her near the windows that looked out over Calgary's lights, the downtown towers, the river valley dark against the illuminated grid, the city spreading east and south in its familiar pattern. The city that had once been the entire world, the city she'd left and returned to, in her own time, on her own terms, carrying a self she'd built in a 650-square-foot cottage by the sea. "You saved yourself," Emma said quietly, leaning against her shoulder. "And you did it so clearly that I know I can do the same thing if I ever need to." Sarah looked at the city lights. She thought about Eleanor Marsh, somewhere in New Mexico, having disappeared from one life and lived in another one for a decade before deciding to send a letter acknowledging she'd seen the blue table from a distance. She thought about arbutus trees peeling their bark. She thought about lopsided mugs and the difference between a song sparrow and a housefinch. "You can," Sarah said. "That's the thing they don't tell you when you're building a life around other people's needs. The whole time you're doing it, you're also capable of doing something else. The capability doesn't disappear, it just waits." She flew back to Salt Spring the following Monday. The seaplane banked over the Gulf Islands on its approach, and she looked down at the water she'd learned to read, the channels, the ferry routes, the dark masses of fir and cedar that made each island its own green world, and felt the thing she'd been feeling for 2 years with increasing intensity. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was there. Not peace exactly, though peace was there too. The thing she felt was harder to name and more valuable for that. The sensation of being fully present in the life she was actually living. Of occupying her own existence the way you occupy a house when it is genuinely yours. Not as a guest, not as a caretaker, but as someone whose presence is its own sufficient justification. She'd been replaced in the life she'd had. She'd been erased from the refrigerator, rearranged from the kitchen, called an awkward presence in her own home. She'd been dismissed with 12 words. "You should probably call first next time. This is awkward for everyone." And those 12 words had broken something in her that had needed breaking for 31 years. What had healed in its place was not the original. It was better. It was the version of Sarah Mitchell that knew the names of trees, that could throw a mug on a wheel and fill it with her own coffee, that had stood in an arbutus grove and understood without being told that some forms of survival require removing the old surface entirely to show what's growing underneath. The taxi from the Ganges terminal turned onto her road. The harbor came into view, the late August light on the water, the heron on the dock piling, the cottage with its cedar walls and its windows. She walked inside, made coffee, sat at the blue table, looked at the harbor. She was home. There is a study from the Harvard Adult Development Study, the longest scientific investigation of adult happiness ever conducted, running for over 80 years. That found the quality of our relationships is the single greatest predictor of health and happiness in later life. Not wealth, not professional achievement, not even physical health. The people who thrived into old age were the ones who had relationships in which they felt genuinely seen. What Sarah Mitchell discovered was the corollary that the study doesn't always articulate clearly. You cannot be genuinely seen in a relationship until you have first seen yourself. The self-erasure that feels like selflessness, that feels like love, that feels like just how things work in a long marriage. It doesn't protect the relationship. It hollows it out. It produces a partnership where one person is infrastructure and the other is living, and both people are diminished by the arrangement, even when only one of them knows it. Research on late-life divorce, which has tripled among people over 50 in the past 3 decades, consistently shows that the partner who initiates the separation, when they've had the time and resources to rebuild, reports dramatically higher life satisfaction within 5 years than those who stayed in the original dynamic. The women who leave in their 50s, who most people assume are making a desperate, reckless choice, are often the ones who live the longest, sleep the best, and experience the most genuine joy. Because the capacity for your own life doesn't disappear when you spend decades living in someone else's. It waits, patiently, without resentment, without urgency, without any of the drama you might expect from something that has been holding still for that long. In the same body that packed 6,000 lunches and organized holiday tables and sat by hospital beds and managed other people's entire existence. It waits, and when you finally arrive at the place where it's been waiting, it says, "I knew you were coming. I've been keeping your seat." It says, "The harbor is the same as you imagined it. The light is exactly what you needed. The arbutus trees are right where you left them, shedding their old bark in long, papery strips, showing what has been underneath all along." All right. Before you go, if this story stayed with you, if you felt even one moment of recognition in Sarah's journey, please hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second and it tells us you want more stories like this one. And drop a comment. I genuinely want to know. Did the part that hit you hardest surprise you? Was it the kitchen? The photograph on the refrigerator? The call about Eleanor Marsh? Tell me in the comments, because the conversation that happens down there is one of my favorite parts of making this channel. If you're not subscribed yet, now is exactly the right moment to change that. This channel exists specifically for stories like this one, where survival is real and justice is earned, and women over 50 get to be the protagonist. And one more thing. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? I love knowing you're out there, in different cities, different time zones, different seasons, all reading the same story at the same moment. Let me know.